The worn floral sofa landed on the curb with a sickening thud, its springs groaning a final, mournful complaint. A thin, persistent drizzle had begun to fall, clinging to the exposed stuffing that bled from a tear in the fabric, making the faded pinks and greens look bruised and dark. Next came a cardboard box, carelessly tossed from the doorway, its contents spilling across the wet pavement. A stack of yellowed letters tied with a ribbon, a small porcelain bird with a chipped wing, and a framed photograph that landed face down in a growing puddle. Eleanor Vance, a woman of 72 whose entire life was now a public spectacle on the cracked sidewalk, did not flinch. She simply stood, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her spine as straight as the nearby lamppost that was beginning to flicker in the dying afternoon light. Her coat was thin, her silver hair damp, but her gaze was fixed, not on the wreckage of her life, but on some distant point beyond the dreary street, a place only she could see. Her silence was a fortress, her stillness a defiance that the jeering man in the doorway couldn't comprehend, let alone breach. Marcus Thorne, the landlord, wiped his fleshy hands on his trousers, a smirk of profound satisfaction twisting his lips. He saw not a person but a problem solved, a unit freed up for higher rent. "That's the last of it, Ellie," he called out, his voice thick with false bonhomie that dripped with contempt. "As per the eviction notice, everything's gotta be off the property by sundown. City ordinance, you know." He gestured vaguely at the pile of her existence as if it were a heap of common trash. Neighbors peered from behind drawn curtains, their windows like vacant eyes in the face of the neighborhood. A few cars slowed, the driver's curiosity sated in a brief, pitying glance before they accelerated away, eager to escape the orbit of such naked misfortune. No one stepped out, no one offered a hand. The shame in the air was thick enough to taste, a coppery mix of rain and collective cowardice. Eleanor was an island, and the sea of indifference was rising around her. She had been judged, dismissed, and discarded, and the world's response was a profound, echoing silence. This was her crisis, laid bare for all to see, and in that first raw moment, it felt as if her quiet dignity was the only thing she had left to her name, a fragile shield against the cold, hard rain and the colder, harder stares of a world that had turned its back. Marcus Thorne savored the moment, leaning against the doorframe of the now empty apartment. He was a man who thrived on the small tyrannies of his position. He wasn't just a landlord. He was a gatekeeper, a petty king ruling over a kingdom of peeling paint and leaky faucets. Seeing Eleanor Vance standing there, so small and still amidst the ruin of her possessions, was a victory that warmed him more than any furnace. She had been a problematic tenant, not because she was late with the rent. She never was, always paying in cash on the first of the month, but because of her silence, her unnerving composure. She never complained, never begged for an extension, never engaged in the desperate little dramas he so enjoyed orchestrating. Her quiet dignity was an affront to him, a silent judgment he couldn't bear. He had manufactured the eviction with glee, using a flimsy clause in the lease about unapproved modifications after she'd installed a simple grab bar in the shower. It was a lie, a pretense, and they both knew it. The real reason was greed. A developer had offered him a tidy sum for the building, contingent on it being delivered vacant. The other tenants had taken his meager buyouts and scattered. But Eleanor had simply looked at him with those clear, steady eyes and said, "This is my home. Should have taken the $500 I offered, Ellie," Thorne taunted, his voice carrying easily across the small lawn. He kicked at a small wooden crate containing her gardening tools. "Could have gotten yourself a motel room for a week. Now look at you. Gonna be a cold night." He wasn't just evicting her. He was performing. The drawn curtains and slowing cars were his audience. He wanted them to see his power, to understand the consequences of defiance. He wanted to break that infuriating stillness she possessed. He saw her as nothing more than a stubborn old woman, a relic from a bygone era who didn't understand the new rules of the world, rules he was an expert at manipulating. Her worth, in his eyes, was less than the debris now littering the curb. The tension on the street was a palpable thing. It wasn't loud or violent. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure of shared guilt. Every neighbor who watched and did nothing was complicit. They told themselves it wasn't their business, that the law was the law, that getting involved would only bring trouble to their own doorsteps. But their silence was an endorsement of Thorne's cruelty, a quiet vote cast in favor of indifference. Eleanor felt their eyes on her, but she didn't look back. To acknowledge their pity would be to accept the role of the victim, and she would not give Thorne that satisfaction. She would stand here until the end, a solitary statue of resilience, while the man who had shattered her life postured and gloated, utterly blind to the true nature of the woman he was trying so desperately to humiliate. Eleanor's stillness was not born of shock or despair, but of memory. As she stared past the miserable scene, she was seeing a different landscape, a sun-drenched porch in a small town she'd left behind decades ago. She could almost smell the honeysuckle and hear the creak of the swing where she sat with her husband, Robert. He had been a man of few words, but his presence was a universe of safety and principle. A sergeant in the Marine Corps, he carried the rigid discipline of his service into every aspect of his life, not as a burden, but as a framework for honor. Dignity, Ellie, he used to say, his large, calloused hand covering hers, is the one thing no one can take from you. They can take your house, your money, your freedom. But your dignity, you have to give that away. Don't ever give it away. That lesson was the bedrock of her soul. Robert had come back from his 2 tours a changed man, quieter and with a haunted look in his eyes that only she could soothe. He never spoke of the things he'd seen, the horrors he'd endured. Instead, he channeled his experiences into a fierce, protective loyalty for those he considered his own. He worked as a mechanic, his hands always stained with grease, but he treated every customer with fairness, often fixing an elderly neighbor's car for the price of a plate of cookies. Among the pile of her belongings, a small, dark wooden box had tumbled open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was Robert's bronze star. The rain was beginning to spot the ribbon, and a primal urge to protect it, to snatch it from the grime, surged through her. But she held herself back. Even that small, frantic movement would be a crack in her composure, a gift to the smirking man in the doorway. The medal wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of a sacrifice she had only partially understood. It was awarded for an act of valor he never discussed, an event that left him with a slight limp and an aversion to loud, sudden noises. After he passed from a heart that had simply worked too hard for too long, she found letters from the men in his unit. They spoke of a man who ran back into the fire, who carried 2 wounded comrades to safety while under heavy enemy assault, who never left a man behind. That was the man whose memory she was honoring with her stillness. She was the widow of a hero, and she would not be reduced to a weeping, helpless figure on a public street. Her quiet strength was his legacy. It was the armor he had unknowingly forged for her over 40 years of marriage, a shield made not of steel, but of unwavering principle. Marcus Thorne saw an old woman. He had no idea he was facing down the last bastion of a United States Marine. The drizzle thickened into a steady, chilling rain. It soaked through Eleanor's thin coat, pasting strands of silver hair to her temples and cheeks. The water ran in rivulets down the legs of the overturned sofa, pooling in the street and turning the scattered letters into a pulpy, illegible mass. The photograph of her and Robert on their wedding day was now completely submerged, the image of their youthful joy dissolving in the gritty water. Thorne, still observing from the dry shelter of the doorway, let out a short, barking laugh. "Looks like God's helping with the cleanup," he called out, his voice laced with venom. "Washing all this junk right into the gutter where it belongs." He checked his watch with an exaggerated gesture of impatience. "Sun's almost down, Ellie. You're officially trespassing if you don't get this mess moved." The pressure was immense, a physical weight that added to the cold seeping into her bones. Her body ached with a weariness that went far beyond the physical. It was the exhaustion of a long, quiet life suddenly thrust into a harsh, unforgiving spotlight. She felt a tremor start in her hands and willed it to stop, clenching them tighter. She would not shake. She would not cry. She would not give him the satisfaction. The community's silence grew heavier with each passing minute, each drop of rain. The faces in the windows had mostly disappeared, the small drama having lost its novelty. They had lives to get back to, dinners to cook, televisions to watch. The plight of the old woman on the curb was an uncomfortable interruption, and now that the initial shock had passed, they were content to let it fade back into the background noise of the city. Her isolation was now complete. She was utterly alone, surrounded by her disintegrating memories, while the architect of her misery watched, waiting for her to break. A wave of profound hopelessness threatened to swamp her. What would she do? Where would she go? The small savings she had were not enough for a deposit on a new apartment. Not in this city. A homeless shelter? The thought sent a spike of pure, cold fear through her. She, the wife of Robert Vance, reduced to a charity case, a number on a cot. The image was so horrifying it almost shattered her resolve. But then she caught sight of the porcelain bird. Its chipped wing pointed skyward like a defiant finger. It was a silly, cheap thing Robert had won for her at a county fair. He had been so proud, handing it to her with a rare, boyish grin. "It's not much," he'd said, "but it's got spirit," and in that moment, seeing that small, broken thing still resisting the deluge, she found her own spirit again. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and met the rain head-on. A figure emerged from the deepening gloom, shuffling slowly along the sidewalk. He was a man whose own life was etched in the lines of his face and the tattered state of his army surplus jacket. He was homeless, one of the city's ghosts, visible only when people chose to see him. He paused near the wreckage, his eyes scanning the scene not with pity, but with a kind of weary recognition. He saw the soaked boxes, the ruined furniture, and the solitary woman standing guard over it all. He bent down and picked up the small, chipped porcelain bird, turning it over in his palm. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes clear and sober. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy. "You dropped this." He held it out to her. Eleanor looked from the bird to the man's face. He was younger than he looked, perhaps in his 50s, but his eyes held the same haunted quality she remembered in Robert's. She saw the faded insignia of a military unit on his jacket sleeve. He was one of them, a brother in a tribe she knew only through her husband's stories. In that instant, her own crisis faded into the background. Here was another soul adrift, another soldier left behind. She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers closing around the single, folded $20 bill she had kept for an emergency. It was her last bit of money in the world. Without a moment's hesitation, she pulled it out. She took the bird from his hand and gently pressed the money into his palm, closing his fingers over it. "You need this more than I do," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Get yourself a hot meal. Stay somewhere warm tonight." The man stared at the bill, then back at her, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. He had expected to be yelled at, to be told to move along. He had not expected this. He had not expected grace. "But, this is all you have," he stammered. Eleanor gave him a small, sad smile. "No," she said, her gaze steady and unwavering. "It's not." From across the street, parked in the shadows near a boarded-up storefront, a man watched the entire exchange. He sat astride a massive, black Harley-Davidson, the engine silent. He was a mountain of a man, clad in worn leather, his face obscured by a thick, graying beard and sunglasses that seemed redundant in the fading light. A large, menacing patch on the back of his vest identified him as a member of the Hells Angels. His name was Deacon, and he was the president of the local charter. He had been on his way to a meeting when the sight of the eviction had caught his eye. He'd seen it 100 times before. The predatory landlord, the helpless victim, the indifferent crowd. It was just another ugly facet of the world he navigated. He had been about to ride on, dismissing it as none of his business, when he saw the old woman's act of quiet generosity. He watched her give her last $20 to a homeless vet. He recognized the jacket insignia, a different war but the same brotherhood, and something inside him shifted. It wasn't just kindness. It was honor. It was a code of conduct he understood better than any law written in a book. It was sacrifice. In a world full of takers, She was a giver, even when she had nothing left to give. He saw her stand a little straighter after the vet had shuffled away, clutching the money like a sacred relic. He saw the unbroken dignity in her posture, a stark contrast to the garbage-strewn curb. Thorne, the landlord, finally gave up on his spectacle, sneering one last time before disappearing inside his house a few doors down, the slam of his door echoing in the wet street. Deacon pulled out his phone, his thumb moving over the screen with surprising speed. He made a single call. The voice on the other end was gravelly. "Yeah, Prez? Deacon here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Change of plans. Round up the chapter. Every single member. I want full colors." There was a pause. "What's the situation?" "We found one of our own," Deacon said, his eyes still fixed on Eleanor, who now stood alone in the rain, a silent, solitary sentinel. "A Marine's widow. They're putting her on the street." The silence on the other end was brief but heavy with understanding. "Where?" Deacon gave the address, his voice cold as steel. "And tell the boys to be quiet on the approach. We're not here to start a party. We're here to pay our respects." He hung up the phone, the world around him seeming to hold its breath. The whispers of respect had begun, not in the community of silent neighbors, but in the heart of a man who recognized a warrior's spirit when he saw one. The first sign was not a sight, but a sound. It began as a faint, low thrumming on the edge of hearing, a vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. It was a sound that could be mistaken for distant thunder, but this was different. It was rhythmic, mechanical, and it was growing steadily, swelling from a murmur into a deep, guttural roar that seemed to make the very air tremble. Lights in the neighboring houses flickered on as people, drawn by the escalating noise, returned to their windows. The sound split, multiplied, resolving into the distinct, staggered growl of dozens, then scores of V-twin engines. It was a sound of immense, controlled power, an iron symphony that announced an arrival. Then they came into view. They turned onto the street not as a scattered group, but as a disciplined column, a river of chrome and black leather flowing through the suburban quiet. Headlights cut through the rain-swept darkness, glinting off wet asphalt and polished steel. 150 Hells Angels, their vests adorned with the iconic death head patch, rode with a solemn, practiced precision. They moved without haste, their presence an overwhelming force of nature. They fanned out, one by one, peeling off from the main column to form a silent, immovable perimeter. They encircled Marcus Thorne's neat little house, their motorcycles parked facing inward, their headlights creating a sterile, interrogating glare that bleached all color from his manicured lawn and rose bushes. When the last bike was in place, a silence fell, sudden and absolute. 150 engines were cut in unison, and the resulting quiet was more menacing than the noise it replaced. There was no shouting, no threats, just the creak of leather and the soft metallic click of kickstands hitting the pavement. The bikers dismounted, standing by their machines, their arms crossed, their faces unreadable. They were a silent army, a wall of hardened men whose collective gaze was fixed on a single point, the front door of Marcus Thorne's house. The community that had been so quick to hide was now utterly captivated, their earlier indifference replaced by a mixture of terror and awe. This was no longer a simple eviction. It had become a reckoning. The truth began to unfold not with a shout, but with a quiet conversation. Deacon swung his leg off his bike and walked slowly across the street toward Eleanor. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, the rain slicking his leather vest. He stopped a few feet from her, his sheer size casting a formidable shadow even in the dim light. Eleanor didn't shrink away. She simply watched him approach, her expression calm, her posture unchanged. She had faced down humiliation. She would not be intimidated by this man. Deacon removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were surprisingly clear and intelligent. They held none of the malice she might have expected, only a deep, penetrating seriousness. He didn't look at the wreckage of her belongings. He looked at her. "Ma'am," he began, his voice a low rumble, respectful. "Your husband was Robert Vance, wasn't he?" Sergeant, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Eleanor's composure finally wavered. A flicker of surprise, of confusion, crossed her face. How? How did you know that? She whispered. Deacon reached into the inner pocket of his vest and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he carefully extracted a faded, creased photograph. It was a picture of a dozen young men in combat fatigues, their faces grimy but their smiles wide, somewhere hot and dusty. He pointed a thick finger at one of the faces. A young man with familiar, steady eyes. That's your Robert, he said softly. Then he moved his finger to a much younger, leaner version of himself standing next to him. And that's me. The breath caught in Eleanor's throat. She stared at the photograph, at the ghost of the man she loved standing beside the giant before her. Robert saved my life, Deacon said. His voice now loud enough for his brothers and the watching neighbors to hear clearly. We were pinned down, ambushed. I took a round to the leg, couldn't move. He came back for me. He came back through a storm of fire and dragged me out of there. His voice grew thick with an emotion that was decades old but still raw. He never left a man behind. That was his code. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the silent ranks of his brothers, then to the lit windows of the houses around them. That is our code. The revelation hung in the air, transforming the scene entirely. This wasn't a random act of biker intimidation. It was a debt of honor being paid. Eleanor was not just some anonymous old woman. She was the widow of a hero, a cherished part of their tribe's history. She was family. The recognition was immediate and profound. The bikers, who had been standing as silent sentinels, began to move with a shared, unspoken purpose. This was not about revenge on the landlord. That was a secondary issue, a problem to be dealt with later, quietly and permanently. This was about restoring dignity. Pack it up, boys, Deacon ordered, his voice cutting through the silence. Handle with care. The men moved not toward Thorne's house, but toward the pathetic pile of Eleanor's life on the curb. Large, tattooed hands that were used to twisting throttles and wrenches now moved with surprising gentleness. They lifted the soaked, floral sofa as if it were a precious artifact, 2 men on each end, carrying it to a large panel van that had quietly pulled up at the end of the street. Others began carefully gathering the scattered letters, the books, the kitchenware. A biker with a skull tattooed on his shaved head spent 10 minutes meticulously trying to repair the chipped wing of the porcelain bird with a small tube of superglue from his toolkit. The community, shamed and humbled, began to emerge from their homes. First one, then another. An older man came out with a roll of heavy-duty trash bags for the ruined items. A young woman appeared with a box of warm blankets and a thermos of hot coffee for Eleanor. The owner of the local diner arrived with sandwiches and soup for the bikers, refusing any payment. It's the least we can do, he mumbled, his face flushed with embarrassment. They had been silent when one woman needed them. They would not be silent now that a brotherhood stood with her. Inside his house, Marcus Thorne watched from behind his blinds, his face pale with terror. The fortress of his smug superiority had crumbled. The bikers ignored him completely, their silent contempt more terrifying than any threat. His power was an illusion, built on the fear of the isolated. Faced with true, unwavering loyalty, he was nothing. After everything was loaded, Deacon walked back to Eleanor. He unpinned a small, simple patch from his own vest. A patch that simply read family. He pressed it gently into her hand. You're not alone anymore, ma'am, he said. The Hell's Angels look after their own. The closure was not loud, but it was absolute. The bikers didn't lay a hand on Marcus Thorne. They didn't have to. Their silent, overwhelming presence had already passed a sentence. His neighbors, now galvanized by their own shame and a newfound respect for Eleanor, would become his jailers. He would be ostracized, his petty cruelties no longer tolerated. His reputation, the only currency he truly valued, was destroyed in a single night. The panel van, followed by Eleanor in a warm car driven by one of the bikers' wives, was escorted across town. They didn't take her to a shelter. They took her to a small, clean, two-bedroom apartment in a quiet, safe building. A few of the bikers were already there, having been sent ahead. The lights were on. The heat was running. The refrigerator was stocked with groceries. They moved her furniture in, placing each piece with care. They set up her bed, hung her pictures, and placed the newly repaired porcelain bird on her nightstand. It was a home, created in a matter of hours by the unlikeliest of angels. When everything was in its place, Deacon stood in the doorway. "The club's covering the first year's rent, ma'am," he said, deflecting her stammered thanks. "It's not charity. It's a debt. Robert earned it for you a long time ago." Eleanor looked around the warm, dry apartment, at her life reassembled, at the faces of these intimidating men who had shown her more kindness than she had seen in years. Tears finally came, not of sorrow or humiliation, but of overwhelming gratitude. She walked over and, standing on her toes, placed a gentle kiss on Deacon's rough, bearded cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank Robert," he replied, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. The bikers filed out, their mission complete. Down on the street, 150 engines roared to life in a single, deafening chorus. It was not a sound of menace anymore. It was a proclamation, a promise. As the thunder of their departure faded into the city's hum, Eleanor looked out her new window. The street was empty, except for a single, black Harley-Davidson parked discreetly in the shadows across the way. A lone rider sat on it, a silent guardian who would remain there through the night, a final, lingering image of dignity restored and respect secured. The community had been transformed. A landlord had been broken, and a brotherhood had reminded the world that some debts are paid not in gold, but in loyalty.